Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, and this is the Jacob Hornberger Show, my weekly internet show. Nice to be back with y'all. I'm president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, a libertarian foundation based in Fairfax, Virginia. It's kind of amusing to see the mainstream press's reaction to all of the protests and demonstrations coming out of the Middle East. They're out there exclaiming, the standard thing that they exclaim every time something like this happens is, why do they hate us? Why do they hate us? Or, another way of putting it is, why don't they love us? Why don't they love us? And, of course, the reason the mainstream press is just so befuddled by this anger and rage against the United States is because, in their mind, the U.S. government is a great freedom provider. It's a great, democracy spreader. And this is what's inculcated in all of these reporters from the first grade. I mean, from the first grade of the public schools that their parents are forced to send them to. It's inculcated. The American government that is a force for good in the world, and the vast military that prowls all over the world, has bases in 130 countries, navies all over the world. It's a force for good. And that gets inculcated in the first grade and then all the way up the line, so that by the time the person becomes an adult, especially in his younger years, and a lot of these reporters are younger, they don't know any better. I mean, for them, their minds have been molded. That the U.S. empire is a force for good. It's a democracy spreader. It's helping people. We're here from the government of the United States, and we're here to help you. And so all of a sudden you've got these massive protests and demonstrations, and you can see the anger. I mean, the anger goes much deeper than a little 15-minute video. You can see that. You can see the rage that's driving these people. And not just the people out on the streets. I mean, then there's always the people that are still at home. And so U.S. officials just say, gosh, we're just so befuddled by all this. We just don't understand it because we love these people. We provide for them. We send them foreign aid. We invade their countries. We wreak death and destruction for their own good. Why don't they love us? And you see, that this is all part of the problem, is that when you've got this imperial mindset, you really do believe that whatever you do for people, that they're the lowly types. You see, you're the imperialist, and they're the colonists. That they need our help is the attitude. That they could not make it without the empire. That they need our supervision. That they're just not competent to run their countries on their own. That you need the empire there. And so, sometimes you have to impose sanctions on these countries. They squeeze the life out of the citizenry. They impoverish the citizenry. We can see that in Iran right now, where the standard of living of the average Iranian is plummeting. Well, it happened in Iraq, and of course there was when all those children were dying. But you see, it was for their benefit, because they had a brutal dictator in power, and so it was necessary to oust the dictator, and the Iraqi people clearly could not do it on their own. They're incompetent, they're ignorant, they lack courage, they lack fortitude. So you need the empire to impose these sanctions to get rid of the dictators and bring freedom and democracy. And when that doesn't work, invade the country. Okay, yeah, there's a few 100,000 people killed, but it's worth it. You see, that those are the words that the U.S. ambassador, Madeleine Albright, used when they asked, well, what about these 500,000 children that have been killed with the sanctions? Is it worth it? And she said, well, it's a tough decision, but yeah, it's worth it. You see, because in their mind, they're bringing benefits to the people. Okay, the few 100,000 that are killed, they don't experience the benefits, but the rest do. I mean, even the ones that, are maimed, lose their sight and their arms and their legs or whatever, they benefit because they've got democracy. You see, and what's really fascinating about this is U.S. officials, the interventionists, and the mainstream press, they're both really proud of what they've accomplished in Iraq. I mean, it's really bizarre. They really think that this is a free society, that it's democratic, that it's a new day, it's a paradise, and that's their mindset. I mean, that's really what's kind of scary. But the reality is reflected by the fact that nobody goes on vacation there. I mean, Iranians go on vacation there, but not one single American family, including the members of Congress, including the President of the United States, not one single American family has gone to Iraq for summer vacation. I mean, doesn't that say it all? And the reason they don't is because they'll be killed. In this land that is supposed to love us because we brought them freedom and democracy, they hate our guts. You see, and that's really the way most people feel about imperialists. I mean, hey, it's the way American colonists felt about the British Empire. Don't forget that was their government, the British colonists. They were not Americans. They were not American citizens. They were dealing with their own government, and they hated their own government because of this imperial mindset that we know what's best for you. We need to take care of you. We will dictate what's going to happen. And so you've got this mindset over here in the United States that's inculcated in the public schools. It's inculcated all the way up. The mainstream press, reinforces it, that America is a force for good in the world. I mean, you can see it on the advertisements on TV. The Navy's out there propagandizing with taxpayer dollars saying the U.S. Navy is a force for good in the world, right? Well, okay, so that's the official mindset over here. One big problem. That's not their mindset over there. You see, because they've got a grip on reality. Let me give you a good example of this. Okay. Hillary Clinton's out there saying, well, we're a democracy spreader. George W. Bush said it, when those infamous WMDs didn't show up, and it was all bogus from the beginning. But when they didn't find them, when they could say, oh, we saved the world from nuclear bombings from Saddam Hussein and mushroom clouds and all that nonsense, they shift gears and said, well, we're really here to help the Iraqis. We're here to democracy spread. Well, the reality is happening under the table, and the reality is what most Americans don't see. I mean, they're out raising their families. They've got jobs to do. They've got problems in their lives, and so they don't have time to devote to the reality of what's going on. So they just read what's in the paper. They watch what's on television, the nightly news, and they say, "Gosh, America is a force for good in the world. We're a democracy spreader." But over there, people have a sense of reality. Why? Because they're the victims of what's going on. I mean, take Saddam Hussein. Okay, remember all this, we've got to oust him, he's a brutal dictator, he's a dangerous dictator. Well, guess what? Throughout the 80s, guess who was one of the best friends, partners, and allies of the U.S. government? Yes, Saddam Hussein. And you say, but that's not possible, Jacob. That's just not possible. I mean, in my public schools, we were taught that America's a democracy spreader, that it spreads freedom and democracy and so forth. That it's just not possible that the U.S. government would partner with a brutal dictator. Hey, it happened. Okay? I mean, they even furnished him with those infamous WMDs. We've got a page on our website. Go, where did Iraq get its weapons? Google that on our website at fff.org, and you'll see all the sources there that when they were partnering with him, they were helping him get WMDs. Why? Because they wanted him to use them to kill Iranians. Okay? Now, you say, well, why would the U.S. government want to kill Iranians? Well, because the Iranians had the audacity of ousting the U.S. installed dictator. Now, you can say that's not possible. America's a democracy spreader. How could they install a dictator into power? Well, this is the two levels on which we operate. We've got the official level up here on the surface, that in the mainstream press, there where you report it and all, in the U.S. pronouncements, in the public schools, America's a democracy spreader, a force for good. Under the table, the CIA, which is a principal branch of the government. In fact, you put the CIA in the military, and I would say their branch is much more powerful than the other three branches. And what the CIA did in Iran was it ousted the democratically elected prime minister, and it installed a brutal dictator. Why? Because the Democratic guy, the one who had been elected, he was independent of the empire. He wouldn't kowtow to the U.S. empire, to the military and the CIA. So they said, let's get rid of him. Let's put in our man. And they put in the Shah of Iran, and this guy was a brutal guy. I mean, you talk about torture and execution, and I mean, he had a secret police force called the Savak that's sort of a combination CIA, FBI, military, all wrapped into one. I mean, you would not believe how this guy brutalized the Iranian people. Oh, by the way, the CIA helped train the members of the Savak, and they supported them, they assisted them, they were partners. And finally, in anger and rage, the Iranian people revolted in 1979, and that's where the problem is that the CIA has never forgiven them for that. And neither has the executive branch of the government and the Congress and the judiciary. I mean, the U.S. government has never forgiven the Iranian people for ousting our man, our dictator. Is that the only instance? Are those the only instances? Saddam Hussein, the Shah of Iran? No. I mean, if you look at Syria, like right now, where the U.S. is, supporting the insurgents to oust the Assad regime from power, what's the ground they use? He's a brutal dictator. He's not elected. Well, guess who used Syria to torture people? Yes, the CIA. Now you see again, you've got the public part of this thing, the public school part, America's a democracy spreader, and every little kid's going around saying, oh, thank the troops because the troops are defending our freedoms and so forth. And, that mindset's getting formed for later on in life. But underneath the table, the CIA cuts a deal with their counterpart in Syria to torture people on behalf of the CIA. Now, you're not going to hear about that in public schools. You're not going to hear about that in the mainstream press. You'll find out about it on the internet. You'll find out about it on our website. But you see, this is not something that they want to talk about because you've got these two pictures that are formed. The public picture of the U.S. government, force for good, U.S. empire, and so forth. And then down here you've got the CIA cutting rendition torture deals where they'll say, look, we'll send a guy to you for torture so that we, on the public side of this thing, can say we oppose torture. Torture is a horrible thing. While under the table, they've got these brutal dictators torturing people on their behalf. And why did they choose Syria to do this? Because it is a brutal dictatorship. I mean, it should be ousted by their own citizens, not by the U.S. government. But that's precisely why the CIA chose them to be their torturer. Because they knew that they were brutal. In fact, if we go to Libya, Gaddafi, they were making secret deals with Gaddafi, the CIA was, to torture people on behalf of the CIA. So again, up here you've got the public persona, the little kids being taught in public schools, America's a force for good, etc., etc., etc. Underneath the table, which public school students will never hear about, the CIA is cutting deals with Gaddafi to torture people on their behalf. I mean, it boggles the mind. In fact, one of the funniest parts of this whole thing in Libya was, first of all, the U.S. government now turning to be a big pro-democracy person, trying to disguise the fact that they had partnered with this guy, Gaddafi, to torture people. But one of the funniest things is that as the revolution reached its culmination, the CIA was rushing in there to try to grab the files so that no Americans would figure out what they had done. And they got beat to the punch, though. Human Rights Watch had representatives that went into the country, got these files, opened them up, and has now issued a report, just in the last week or so, issued a report about the CIA's program of torture and rendition, where, believe it or not, they took people who had tried to oust Gaddafi, Libyans, who were living outside the country, and on Gaddafi's request, because Gaddafi said, bring them to me. I want to torture them. I want to kill them. I want to show them what happens to people that betray their country. And the CIA said, yes, sir. And so they brought in these people into Libya where they were brutally tortured because they had tried to oust the dictatorship. In other words, they were doing what the U.S. government later jumped on the bandwagon and said we need to do. And of course, there's the example of Egypt, where you see all these protests today, where the U.S. government has been the principal supporter, enabler of the brutal military dictatorship in Egypt. I mean, sure, they turn against Mubarak at the very last minute when it's obvious that he has to go. And they say, oh, we're on the side of democracy, we're on the side of democracy, and all the public school kids are saying, America's on the side of democracy, and they're singing and everything. Well, the truth is that they chose the Egyptian military dictatorship to be another rendition torture partners. I mean, they would kidnap people, the CIA would, and they would take them to Egypt, and for what purpose? Well, so that they could say to the American people, gosh, we're different from Egypt and all those other countries. We don't torture. Well, because they were sending the people to this dictatorship for the purpose of torturing these people. And of course, you talk about the $1.2 billion a year that's funneled into the Egyptian military. I mean, there's no question about the fact that this is a dictatorship, has been a dictatorship. Even if Mubarak wore his, civilian clothes, this was a military dictatorship in every sense of the word, similar to the Pinochet dictatorship in Argentina. And what we've got to remember is that for the 30 years the U.S. has been supporting this with our money, taxpayer money, they believed in the system. They believed in the military holding this dictatorial grip on power in Egypt. And the military there has the same vast influence in that society as the military here does. I mean, they play a dominant role in the economy, just as the military does here. Massive amounts of people work for the military. Nobody really knows how many, because the military won't disclose it, and the military is ultimately in charge in that country. And you've got the military, owning hotels and not submitting their budget for review. I mean, they're in control, in other words. And the U.S. has supported this. They've believed in it. I mean, the Pentagon and the generals over there, they get together, they socialize, they work together. The U.S. government has believed in this system because it keeps order and stability. Now, why all this $1.2 billion a year in tanks and guns and bullets and so forth? Well, they'll say, oh, well, it's for defense. It's for defense. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, who are they going to get in a war with? Israel? I mean, here we are funneling all this cash and armaments to Israel and all this cash and armaments to Egypt, and they're the only ones likely to get in a war with each other. No. The purpose of developing that strong military is to maintain its control and power, so that those protesters, or if anybody even gets the idea of ousting this regime from power through violence, he's up against the tanks, the guns, the armaments, the weaponry, the tear gas, everything made in the USA. And that's the whole purpose of fortifying a dictatorship, is to be able to maintain its iron grip on power. Now, okay, Americans generally don't know all this. Why should they? They read, the mainstream press, they watch the news on television. I mean, you got to really dig. You got to go to the libertarian sites. You got to go to some of the liberal sites. Not all of them. The good ones are like Glenn Greenwald. The ACLU's been great on this. There's been a few others. But by and large, liberals have done what Republicans did, conservatives did when George W. Bush was in office. They've sealed their lips because their man's in office. Obama, as we know, turned his back on everything he had promised on civil liberties and foreign policy and so forth, and ends up the liberals say, "Oh, we'll seal our lips. We can't say a thing." But you see, for libertarians and the few liberals out there that have taken a realistic view of this, we see reality for what it is. We see reality the way the victims over there see reality. I mean, when they say, well, why are these Libyans so mad at the U.S.? Why did they kill Americans? We liberated them. We brought them democracy. We gave them a start. Well, what they forget is that they killed a lot of people in this process. Now, the attitude of the U.S. is, yeah, but those deaths are worth it. they're worth it. I mean, how cavalier is that? You know, to kill multitudes of people and say, yeah, it's worth it. Look at the survivors. Look how happy you should be. Well, except for those survivors include the family members of the people who got killed, whether they were brides or you know, husbands or daughters or children or whatever. That creates a lot of anger and rage. And in fact, that's precisely the rage. What you're seeing right now is what was taking place prior to 9/11. And we talked about it at the Future of Freedom Foundation. You can go back to our essays before 9/11, and we kept saying, if you don't stop this sanctions against Iraq that is killing these hundreds of thousands of children, these idiotic, illegal, no-fly zones, the stationing of troops in Mecca and Medina, you know, insulting Muslims, the unconditional support of the Israeli government. If you don't stop this, you're going to see a terrorist attack on American soil. And U.S. officials, and of course all the interventionists said, that's ridiculous, that could never happen, all the nonsense, the world loves America, we're a force for good in the world, we're a democracy spreader. And of course we see the results. And you know, it didn't take a rocket scientist for us to predict 9/11. Chalmers Johnson, by the way, the noted scholar who's now deceased, a former consultant for the CIA, he did the same thing in his book Blowback. Fantastic book. I highly recommend if you haven't read it. In fact, read all 4 of his books. They're fantastic. But he said the same thing. If you don't stop this rage is going to culminate. And of course, we had seen the prelude to it. We had seen the attacks on the USS Cole. We had seen the 93 attack on the World Trade Center. I mean, that was just really a prelude to what was going to happen on 9/11. I mean, in principle, it's no different. Wasn't as successful, but the attack was the same. The motivation was the same. The anger and the rage over what the U.S. empire has been doing. Now, you know, you do have a situation now in Egypt that is fascinating, because you've got a guy that's been elected in the Muslim Brotherhood who's clearly not part of the military, and the military permitted him to win. I mean, and that's the only nice way to put it. They permitted him to win. They had already dissolved Congress because the military is in charge. The military has already said, we're not going to submit to any kind of control. We are the ones in control. We will make the ultimate decisions. And now you've got Morsi over there, the new president, that's obviously acting independent not only of the military, but also of the U.S. government. Now, the U.S. government and the military, keep in mind, are very close. In fact, that $1.2 billion goes into the coffers of the military. The check's not made co-payable to Morsi, and there's no legislature involved here. So the U.S. continues sending its money into the military. And so you've got a fascinating situation developing here. You've got Morsi over there visiting Tehran and playing nice with the Iranians, going to China, making deals there. The U.S., as we all know, considers China an economic rival. And, of course, Iran is their arch enemy, owing to, you know, the ouster of the Shah of Iran. And so all of a sudden Morsi's not being a loyal member of the empire. And so you've got a fascinating situation developing here. Now, keep in mind that if the Iranian people decide to revolt against the military rule and say, no, we're going to put you under civilian control, and the military says no, and it turns to violence, the military will be using weaponry, tanks, guns, bullets, and tear gas, and so forth, provided them by the U.S. government, and that still provides them weaponry and cash. And keep that in mind. And the torture chambers. I mean, the government in Egypt, the military, has the same power over the Egyptian people that Obama now has over the American people. The power to send the military to effect arrests of citizens, to torture them, to hold them indefinitely without trial, to execute them, maybe after some kangaroo tribunal and so forth. In fact, that's kind of a lesson here. I mean, you know, people, the interventionists keep saying, why do you libertarians and a few of the liberals keep fighting for civil liberties? Well, because, you know, it's a sign when you're adopting powers, emergency powers, that the Egyptian dictatorship is adopting. That's a pretty strong sign that something's not right in this country. And, of course, their emergency powers have gone on for 30 years. This government powers over here have gone on 10 or 11 years. You know, it's just not not a good situation. Now, so how's this thing going to develop in Egypt? Impossible to predict. But I said on my blog a few months ago, watch Egypt. And this was before everything was happening. I said, watch Egypt. Because this thing is very, very fascinating. You see U.S. officials saying, why are we continuing to fund them their money if Morsi's not playing ball with us? Of course, they'll never call for a termination of the $1.2 billion because they want to keep ties in with the military. That way, if Morsi gets out of hand, gets a little bit too independent, there's always a chance of a military coup. I mean, keep in mind, that's what happened in Argentina in 1973, where the U.S., the CIA again, precipitated the conditions, making the economy plunge. Nixon called it, make the economy scream in Chile. Now, did I say Argentina? I meant Chile. Make the economy scream, and then, of course, our military was very close with their military. They had been trained at the School of the Americas. There was close alliances, and so when the coup came, the U.S. government, the CIA, the military, they loved it. They absolutely loved it, and they really believed in Pinochet and the military dictatorship, and killing all these so-called communists, rounding them up, torturing them, including 2 Americans, by the way. They killed 2 Americans with the complicity of the CIA. Did anything happen? No, of course not. I mean, nothing's going to happen to the CIA when they kill Americans, and that proved it in Argentina. Well, it's that relationship with the military in Egypt that they want to maintain, so that's always a standby possibility. They just kick Morsi out, put in their man, and go happily on their way. But it's unclear as to what's going to happen with the Chilean people. I mean, the Egyptian people. Now, keep one thing in mind, though, that while it's still legal in the United States to recite the Declaration of Independence, it's not legal to exhort people in Egypt to overthrow their dictatorship, no matter how tyrannical it might be. You don't want to put yourself in a position of exhorting them to overthrow their tyrannical regime. That's illegal. I mean, you do that, they're going to put you in jail. They're going to indict you for supporting terrorism. Now, clearly, the Egyptian government considers, people who overthrow the regime terrorists. I mean, duh. Every regime considers people that violently overthrow their government terrorists. But what's interesting about the Egyptian situation is because of the close alliance between the Egyptian military and the U.S. military and the CIA, the U.S. government considers that Americans who exhort people in Egypt to overthrow the regime to be terrorists too, or supporters of terrorism. And so you don't want to get in that position unless you want to subject yourself to criminal prosecution. Now, apparently it's still okay to exhort people to oust tyrannical regimes that are not part of the U.S. empire, like Syria or Libya. It's okay to say, hey, boy, you people are doing great. Get on in there and oust those regimes through violence, and we're going to support you and all. We're going to wish you well. I think that's still legal because, I mean, you've got Obama doing it. You've got Romney doing it and so forth. But when it comes to members of the U.S. empire, Bahrain. I mean, Bahrain's a good example where you got the brutal dictatorship, but you got a military base there, U.S. military base. So you don't want to be exhorting people to be doing that, or in Egypt. Now, Hillary, of course, says, we're not going to retreat. We're not going to retreat. And it's just imperial talk. I mean, isn't that the way the French Empire spoke in Vietnam after World War II, when the Vietnamese thought they were going to be free and independent, after getting rid of the Japanese occupiers? The French come in and say, we will not retreat from the world. We will stay here. Well, yeah, part of their imperial mindset to control this country. And then when 54 came along, Dien Bien Phu, the Vietnamese beat them in that final battle. The U.S. comes in and says, we're not going to retreat from the world. We're coming into Vietnam. And that's the imperial mindset, okay? That the world needs the empire in order to survive, to prosper. When actually, it's the worst thing that can happen. The empire, nobody likes an empire except the imperialist. And that's one of the main reasons that there's so much anger and rage and hatred is that they're tired of being treated like peons. The British Empire was there, the French Empire is there, and now the American Empire is there. Look at Switzerland. Do you see any Swiss angsting and anxious, like, oh, what's going to happen in Iraq and what's going to happen in Afghanistan and, oh, Egyptian? No. Now, have they retreated from the world? Well, I guess somebody might say that, but really, all they're doing is exemplifying the foreign policy that was what was once the United States. Well, the founding principles of the United States, that mind your own business. Withdraw all the troops, bring them home, get out of the Middle East. Hillary can call it whatever she wants, retreating from the world or whatever. It's dismantling this empire. That's the crux of the problem. So when you see Obama and Romney battling it out as to whose foreign policy is better, it's just a battle of interventionists. It's the interventionism that is the root of the problem. Now, we're going to be talking about this on our College Civil Liberties Tour. It's coming up. Countdown now. It's about a month away. We're going out west. We're going to Seattle, Sacramento, San Diego, Tucson, and Boulder, Colorado. And we're doing this in partnership with the Young Americans for Liberty. And this is the kind of thing we're going to be talking about. And Glenn Greenwald is going to be on the tour. In fact, check out his blog today on The Guardian. It's fantastic on this freedom of speech issue as to, as to what Americans are free to do and not do these days. And he's going to be on the tour. Bruce Fine, who's one of the greatest speakers on the Constitution and foreign policy and civil liberties that you'd ever find. I'll be speaking. Jack Hunter's going to be there. If you're in these areas, we'd love to have you join us. They're going to be predominantly college students. We're raising their vision as to why this thing is so important, why it's so important to the future of our country, that we continue battling for non-interventionism, the restoration of civil liberties to our land, the sound money, sound fiscal policy. It's taken our country down in more ways than one. And it's up to us, the libertarians, to lead the world out of this morass. That's the show. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.